By the ninth year, I had stopped rationalizing quite so hard and started quietly protecting myself not primarily from Bridget's requests, which still mostly said yes to out of habit as much as anything else, but from the slow erosion of my own certainty about what was actually true in this family. I kept my private ledger meticulously now, no longer bothering to hide it from myself as a note, calling it in my own head exactly what it was. I saved screenshots of texts. I forwarded certain emails to a personal account Daniel didn't have access to, not because I thought I'd ever need them in any formal sense, but because some old professional instinct, the one that had made me genuinely good at my job for 15 years, told me that a story this consistently inconsistent would eventually need to be checked against the actual paper trail, whether I wanted that day to come or not. That February brought two requests in quick succession: $600 for a plumbing emergency early in the month, and then, only 11 days later, the $4,100 request for Sophie's school deposit that I opened this story with, standing in Bridget's kitchen with a mug of coffee going cold in my hand. It was 3 days before that kitchen conversation, a detail I want to be precise about because the timing matters, that the email arrived. The one that would sit unread in my inbox for 11 more days after that kitchen conversation happened, quietly waiting while I went on with my life not knowing it was there. It came from an address I didn't recognize at first glance, easy to skim past on a busy week. A woman named Renata Ibarra, who turned out to be the estate attorney handling Great-Aunt Lewis's affairs, the very same great-aunt whose coming inheritance Bridget had referenced months earlier as informal collateral for that $4,000 bridge loan back in year 8. The subject line was administrative, dull, exactly the kind of thing that gets filtered past on autopilot during a busy week. Ray, estate distribution follow-up documentation request. I assumed when I finally noticed it in my inbox that it was misdirected or possibly spam dressed up to look official, and I let it sit there unopened for 11 more days while life continued around it. When I finally opened it on a slow, unremarkable Sunday evening, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside my laptop, what I found inside was a request for verification of a Venmo account, my Venmo account. According to the account name and phone number listed, that had apparently been used roughly 18 months earlier to receive a partial early distribution from Lewis's estate on Bridget's behalf, per prior arrangement with Bridget Hartley as her sister-in-law and financial contact of record. I had never received any distribution from Lewis's estate. I had never agreed in any conversation I could remember to be anyone's financial contact of record. And when I logged into the actual Venmo account listed in the email, an account that carried my legal name and an old cell phone number I hadn't used in 3 years, but a username, M. Hartley Finance, that I had never created and did not recognize, I found a version of my own identity that Bridget had apparently built, piece by piece, over roughly 2 years, to route money through in ways that were considerably harder to trace back to her directly, should anyone ever look closely enough to ask. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that night, longer than I can accurately estimate now, looking back. I didn't cry and I didn't call Daniel immediately, which surprised even me a little in the moment. I just sat very still, the way you do when a number in a spreadsheet is wrong by an amount too specific, too deliberately shaped to be an honest mistake, and you understand before you've even finished rechecking the math that it isn't an error at all. It's a decision someone made on purpose over a long period of time that they very specifically did not want you to see. That's the gut punch quiet I want you to sit with for a second, because there was no shouting in that kitchen that Sunday night, no dramatic confrontation, nothing cinematic about it at all. There was just me, alone, and a laptop, and 11 days of unread email that suddenly felt like they'd been waiting for exactly the right moment to matter. And the slow, cold, entirely undramatic understanding that whatever I had believed this family was for 9 careful, generous, exhausted years, it wasn't that. It had never quite been that. I want to describe the next hour in some detail because I think it matters, and because it's the part of this story people ask me about most when they hear it in person. I didn't close my laptop. I sat with it open, the Venmo transaction history glowing in front of me in the dark kitchen, and I did the only thing I actually knew how to do with information like that. I started organizing it. Not emotionally, professionally. I opened a blank spreadsheet, the same kind I'd use for any client engagement at work, and I began transcribing every transaction visible on that account, one row at a time: timestamp, amount, sender name where visible, note field where one existed. 22 transactions in total, spanning back just over 23 months, ranging from Denise's $50 to a single, larger transfer of $600 from a cousin of Frank's I'd met exactly once, at a funeral 4 years earlier. I worked until nearly 2 in the morning that first night, not because I needed to finish. There was no deadline, no client waiting on the other end of it, but because the work itself was the only thing keeping the feeling in my chest at a manageable size. Somewhere around midnight, I remember sitting back in my chair and laughing once, quietly at nothing in particular, a short, involuntary sound that surprised me more than anything else that whole night. I think it was the specific absurdity of it, that after 9 years of feeling slightly unhinged for keeping a private note in my phone, the actual scale of what had been happening turned out to be larger, stranger, and more deliberately constructed than even my most private, most guilty suspicions had ever let themselves imagine. What I found. Over the following 3 weeks, using nothing more exotic than the skills I'd spent 15 years building professionally, I put together a picture that took my breath away with how simple it turned out to be, once I finally, deliberately stopped looking away from it. The school fund envelope in Carol's garage, the one I'd found and not opened 2 years earlier, I finally asked Carol about directly, gently framing the question as help with her ongoing move, careful not to alarm her before I understood more myself. Carol, who I don't believe was ever a willing or knowing participant in what her daughter had quietly built, opened it in front of me without a moment's hesitation, without even seeming to register it as significant. Inside was $1,100 in cash and a single folded piece of paper. A running list in Bridget's own handwriting of dates and dollar amounts going back 4 years, labeled plainly at the top, backup if Mari or Dan ever ask for receipts. It wasn't a school fund at all. Sophie's actual tuition, I would later confirm directly through the school's own billing office with Carol's help, had been paid in full every single year by Frank and Carol themselves directly to the school automatically each August, a fact Bridget had never once mentioned to me, even as she asked me more than once across multiple years for money explicitly earmarked for Sophie's education. The pattern, once I laid it all out properly in an actual spreadsheet, because of course I made a spreadsheet, columns for date, amount, stated purpose, method of payment, and a final column I labeled with a kind of grim humor that surprised even me, verified, showed something I hadn't let myself add up while I was still living inside it day to day. Across 9 years, I had given, loaned, or been drawn into indirectly covering a total of $31,400 in direct and indirect support to Bridget. That total I could now document, with actual receipts and dates cross-referenced against school records, medical billing offices, and bank statements, that at least $14,000 of it had been requested using a stated purpose, medical bills that were never filed, school cost already covered by someone else, an emergency that turned out to have already been quietly resolved before the request was even made to me, that simply wasn't true at the time the request was made. And running underneath all of it, for the better part of 2 years, was the Venmo account built in a version of my identity, receiving small, steady transfers that Bridget had been carefully routing from a handful of sympathetic extended family members. And even I discovered with a specific and very particular kind of cold clarity that I still remember exactly, from 2 of my own coworkers, people I saw every week at the office, who Bridget had reached out to directly on social media, introducing herself warmly as Mari's sister-in-law, helping coordinate something for the family. Hope that's okay to ask you directly. Never once telling me she'd done it, never once telling either of them that the money wasn't actually going through me at all, was never going to reach me, and had nothing whatsoever to do with anything I had agreed to help coordinate. I want to be precise here, because precision is the only thing that ever genuinely protected me in this entire story, the only tool I had that Bridget's version of events couldn't easily bend. I don't believe Bridget set out on some specific day 9 years earlier to deliberately build a scheme from scratch. I believe it built itself the way these things almost always do, one small unrepaid favor becoming the quiet template for the next one. One flattering lie about trusting me more than the bank becoming a door she realized. Gradually, she could walk back through again and again, each time a little more easily than the last, until the version of me she actually needed for it all to keep working smoothly stopped being a real specific person to her at all, and became something closer to a resource. A line item, a financial contact of record, useful precisely because I could be counted on not to ask too many questions. The decision. I didn't do anything outwardly for 6 weeks after that Sunday night. I want you to understand that clearly because I think people sometimes imagine a moment like this leads immediately, cleanly to confrontation, and for me, honestly, it didn't. It led first to a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years, a stillness that was almost peaceful in its own strange way, the stillness of finally being certain about something I had spent 9 long years being gently, persistently told I was imagining. The first person I told was my closest friend from graduate school, a woman named Priya Ose, who had gone on to become a forensic auditor herself, working now for a large regional firm, and who listened to the entire unbroken story over nearly 2 hours at her kitchen table, without once interrupting me, without once reaching for her phone, giving me the kind of full, undivided attention I hadn't fully realized, until I was receiving it, how much I had been missing for years. When I finally finished talking, she sat quietly for a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table in front of her, and then asked me one question that I still think about regularly, even now. "What are you actually afraid of here?" she said. "Not the money. I don't think this was ever really about the money for you. What's the real thing underneath it?" I sat with that question longer than I expected to, longer than felt comfortable in the silence of her kitchen. And when I finally answered it out loud, for what I realized was the first time I had ever said it plainly, to anyone, including myself, I understood something about my own life that the previous 9 years had been quietly, invisibly built on top of. "I'm afraid," I told her, my voice smaller than I meant it to be, "that if I stop being the one who fixes everything, I stop being anything to them at all. I don't actually know who I am in that family, Priya, if I'm not useful to it." Priya didn't try to argue me out of the fear or minimize it or rush past it towards some tidier, more comfortable conclusion. She just said, carefully, choosing her words the way I imagine she chooses them when she's presenting difficult findings to a client, "That's not really a fear about Bridget, Marion. That's a fear about whether you're allowed to simply exist in a family without earning your place in it every single week on demand. And you already know the answer to that question. I think you've always known it. You just haven't let yourself fully believe it yet, because believing it means admitting how much you've been giving away in exchange for something that was never actually conditional to begin with." I drove home from Priya's house that night with the windows down despite the cold, needing the air on my face, needing to feel something other than the tight, coiled stillness that had been sitting in my chest for 6 weeks. I didn't cry until I was parked in my own driveway, engine off, hands still on the wheel, and even then it wasn't the kind of crying that comes from grief exactly. It was closer to relief, the specific, disorienting relief of finally being handed permission, by someone I trusted completely, to believe what I had already quietly known. The second person I told was Daniel, and I want to be fair to him in how I tell this next part, because his reaction wasn't defensive and it wasn't dismissive, the way I had half-braced myself for it to be after 9 years of watching him instinctively protect his family's version of events. It was quiet instead, and it was genuinely devastated, in a way I hadn't seen from him before, not once in 11 years of marriage. I laid the spreadsheet out on our dining table, printed and organized by year, tabbed the way I'd tab evidence for any professional case. And I let him go through it entirely himself, line by line, without narrating it for him or softening it as he went, because I understood somehow that I needed him to arrive at the conclusion on his own terms, in his own time, not simply accept mine secondhand. It took him nearly 40 minutes to read through it completely in total silence while I sat across the table and let him. When he finally finished, he sat back in his chair, set both hands flat on the table on either side of the pages, and said very softly, almost to himself more than to me, "I think I've known some version of this for years, honestly. I think I've just never let myself actually add it up on paper, because doing that would mean admitting that my whole childhood ran on a story that wasn't fully true, and I wasn't ready to be the one who found that out." That was the exact moment I understood fully and finally that Daniel wasn't my adversary in any of this. He was, in his own way, another person this family had quietly, gradually asked to disappear into a role over 39 years. The fixer, the steady one, the one who never got to have needs of his own that mattered as much as his sister's. and it had taken him nearly 4 decades to see the shape of it laid out plainly in front of him in black and white, in a spreadsheet his own wife had built at their own kitchen table. We didn't resolve anything that night. I want to be honest about that too. We sat together for a long time afterward, not talking much, Daniel occasionally going back to reread a particular line, and at one point he reached over and took my hand, not to comfort me exactly, but as though he needed to hold on to something solid while the ground under 39 years of family mythology quietly, permanently shifted underneath him. The third person I spoke to, about 2 weeks after that conversation with Daniel, was an attorney, a longtime family friend of my own parents named Robert Ashworth, purely for informational purposes at that stage. I want to be very clear that this story does not end with a lawsuit because pursuing one was never really what I was after, and I want to say that honestly rather than let anyone watching assume otherwise. What I wanted from Robert, sitting in his modest downtown office with my spreadsheet in a folder on my lap, was simple: to understand, factually and without emotion attached, what I was and wasn't legally exposed to, given that an account bearing my own legal name had been used without my knowledge or consent to move other people's money for the better part of 2 years. He confirmed, after looking through the documentation carefully, what I had already begun to suspect on my own, that I likely had real grounds to pursue something formally against Bridget if I chose to. And that, at an absolute minimum regardless of what else I decided, I needed to close that Venmo account immediately and document everything, in writing, dated and organized, without further delay. What Robert said to me next, though, as I was gathering my things to leave, stayed with me far longer than any of the actual legal advice he'd given. He looked at me over the top of his glasses and said, "You've spent 9 years being the reasonable one in a family that mistook your reasonableness for a bottomless resource, Marion. I've watched families like this before more than you'd think. The truth doesn't have to be a weapon if you don't want it to be one. Sometimes it's just the bill finally being sent to the right address after years of it quietly landing on the wrong desk." The real fear, underneath all of it, the thing I kept circling back to on long drives home from work, on nights I couldn't sleep and lay staring at the ceiling doing math in my head out of pure old habit, in the shower where the best and the worst thoughts always seemed to arrive uninvited, was never really about the money at all, not even close. And I think I'd known that from the very beginning, even when I was still calling it something else. It was the question Priya had named so precisely that single afternoon at her kitchen table: who am I to this family if I stop being useful to them? For 9 years, my worth in that house had been measured, silently but consistently, in what I could absorb. Bridget's crises, Daniel's inherited guilt, Carol and Frank's exhausted, unspoken hope that if everyone just kept being generous enough, kept smoothing things over enough, the family would never have to look directly at what Bridget had slowly become or ask themselves how they'd helped her become it. I had built an entire piece of my own identity inside that family around being the one who never made anyone deal with a hard truth. And I was genuinely deeply terrified in those 6 weeks of quiet before I acted, that the moment I stopped playing that role, I would find out I had never actually been loved in that house at all, only relied upon, only needed in the specific hollow way a useful tool is needed. That there was a real, meaningful difference between the two, and I had spent 9 years carefully, deliberately not wanting to find out which one I actually had. I sat with that fear for a long time before I finally let it go, turning it over and over the way I'd turn over a stubborn discrepancy in a set of books, looking for the exact place where it stopped balancing. What finally moved me past it wasn't anger in the end, though I certainly had plenty of that available to me by then. It was Sophie's drawing, still folded carefully in my desk drawer where it had sat for years, Aunt Mari, standing next to Uncle Daniel holding a dog we didn't have. I realized, sitting alone in my office one evening with that drawing in my hands, that I wasn't only protecting my own dignity anymore, however much that mattered to me. I was deciding whether I wanted the responsibility or not, what kind of pattern Sophie would grow up watching play out around her, what she would learn to expect from the adults she loved, what she would eventually come to believe love was supposed to cost. And I decided, finally, sitting there with a 9-year-old's crayon drawing in my hands, that I would rather risk finding out I wasn't loved in the way I'd hoped than teach an 8-year-old girl, through my own continued silence, that love and usefulness were ever supposed to be the same transaction. The confrontation. I chose the setting deliberately, the way I'd choose the format and structure of an audit report before presenting it to a client, not for drama, not for effect, but because the setting itself needed to communicate something true before a single word was spoken. I asked Carol if we could all have dinner together at her house, Frank, Carol, Daniel, Bridget, and me, for what I told her, honestly if incompletely, was a family conversation about some financial questions before things get more confusing than they need to be for everyone. Sophie, at my specific and firm request, stayed at a friend's house that particular evening. I wanted the truth to finally land in that room clearly and completely, but I did not want an 8-year-old anywhere near the sound of it landing. I brought a binder. I know exactly how that sounds, and I've made a kind of peace with how it sounds in the time since. 9 years of careful, patient, folksy family warmth were undone in the end by a woman with a 3-ring binder and 22 carefully tabbed pages, because that is fundamentally who I am, and I stopped quietly apologizing for it somewhere around page 11 of putting the whole thing together at my kitchen table over 3 long weekends. Bridget arrived 12 minutes late to dinner that night, which by then felt almost ceremonial. A small, familiar ritual playing out one final time without either of us fully realizing it was the last time it would. Dinner itself was tense in the specific, overpolite way family dinners get when everyone at the table senses something significant is coming and nobody wants to be the one who says so out loud first. Carol had made too much food the way she always did when she was nervous. Frank barely touched his plate. I waited deliberately until everything had been cleared away and the table was empty in front of us. Then I opened the binder. I didn't raise my voice, not once, through any part of what came next. I want to be completely honest with you about that because it would be easy telling this story after the fact to imagine myself finally getting my moment to shout, to finally let 9 years of quiet frustration boil over dramatically across a dinner table, and that is not what happened, and I am genuinely proud that it isn't what happened. I spoke the way I speak in a formal deposition or in front of a client reviewing a difficult set of findings, calmly, in careful chronological order, with exact dates attached to every claim. I laid out the total first, $31,400 across 9 years, stated plainly, without embellishment. I laid out the $14,000 specifically tied to stated purposes that weren't true at the time the request was made, walking through 3 or 4 representative examples in detail, watching Carol's face change with each one. I placed, on the table in front of everyone, a printed copy of the Venmo account screenshots, my own legal name attached to transactions I had never made, never authorized, and never even known existed until an estate attorney's routine email happened to surface them. I placed the folded list I'd found in the envelope in Carol's own garage directly beside it, backup if Mari or Dan ever ask for receipts, and I watched in real time as Carol's face folded in on itself, recognizing all at once exactly what she had unknowingly been keeping safe in her own garage for 2 full years. Bridget went white and then a deep, blotchy red in the span of what felt like about 10 seconds. She started fast, defensive, the guilt-trip machinery running now on pure old instinct, the way a familiar song plays itself out even after you've stopped consciously singing along. You're really doing this at Mom's dinner table, tonight of all nights. After everything I've been through, you're going to sit here with a binder. I let her finish completely. I didn't interrupt her, not once, because interrupting would have made the entire moment about volume, about who could speak louder or faster, and volume was never, at any point in this story, where my actual power lived. When she was finally done, when the room had gone quiet again, I said the one line I had written and rewritten more carefully than anything else in that entire binder. The line I had promised myself, alone in my office weeks earlier, that I would say clearly exactly once, and then simply let stand on its own without adding anything further to soften or explain it. Bridget, I never once refused to help you, not one single time in 9 years. I just needed the reason to be real. And for 9 years you made absolutely sure it never was, because you understood long before I did that I would say yes to almost anything as long as I still believed it was true. The room was completely silent after that, for what felt like a very long time. Frank put his head down into his hands, elbows braced on the table. Carol was crying, not performatively, not the way I had watched her cry through 9 years of Bridget's engineered crises, but quietly, privately, in the specific exhausted way of a mother realizing all at once that she had spent 3 decades carefully protecting the wrong version of a story, at real cost to people she loved. Daniel reached over under the table and took my hand, the same gesture from that Thanksgiving 9 years earlier, except this time it didn't mean let it go. This time it meant, as clearly as a gesture can say anything, I see it now too, finally all of it, and I'm not going to look away from it again. I want to describe what happened in the minutes right after I said that line, because the room didn't move in a straight line from there to some tidy resolution. It moved in fits and starts, the way real difficult conversations actually do, not the way they do in movies. Frank was the first to speak, after a silence that must have lasted close to a minute, though it felt much longer sitting inside it. He didn't address me. He turned to Bridget and said in a voice I'd never heard him use before, quiet but with something hard underneath it, "Is this true, all of it? I need you to actually answer me, Bridget, not explain it, not tell me what I don't understand. Just tell me if the numbers on those pages are true." Bridget didn't answer right away. She looked down at the binder, then at her own hands, and when she finally said, "Some of it's not as bad as it looks," Frank closed his eyes for a long moment, and I watched something in him that had probably been holding steady for 30 years quietly give way. Carol reached across the table, not toward Bridget, but toward the folded list from the envelope, and picked it up herself, reading it again more slowly this time, her lips moving faintly over some of the dates as though she were trying to match them against her own memory of those years, trying to figure out where she had been standing, what she had been doing, while all of this was happening in rooms she thought she understood. "I wrote, 'Do not open until needed,'" she said, mostly to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was helping you save something for later. I didn't know I was helping you hide something from your own brother's wife." Bridget did have one genuine moment in all of this, and I want to include it honestly, because this story isn't truthful if I let myself pretend she was only ever cold or purely calculating underneath it all. She looked down at the binder for a long moment, and then over at Sophie's empty chair at the far end of the table, and something in her seemed to genuinely, visibly break open. "I don't know how to be anything except the one who needs help," she said very quietly, not performing it for anyone in the room, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "If I'm not that in this family, I honestly don't know what's left of me." For one long moment I felt something close to real grief on her behalf, seeing so plainly, laid bare across the table between us, exactly the same fear I had spent 6 agonizing weeks working through myself, the terror of not knowing who you are without the specific role you've always been given to play. Even sitting there with the full, documented proof of 9 years of exactly what that terror had ultimately cost me, I felt it, that flicker of grief for her, and I let myself feel it fully without letting it change a single word of what I'd already said. Aftermath. The weeks that followed weren't a movie ending, and I think it's important that I tell you that plainly and honestly, because I don't believe in stories that wrap themselves up too neatly, and I don't think this one deserves to be told that way either. Carol and I are closer now than we've ever been in the 11 years I've known her. She calls me every other Sunday afternoon without fail, and last month she told me, unprompted, her voice steady but clearly costing her something to say, "I should have looked closer years ago." I let myself not look, because looking would have meant I had to actually do something about what I saw, and I wasn't brave enough for that for a long time. Frank and I still drive to his follow-up cardiology appointments together sometimes, though his knee has long since fully healed. I think honestly we both just genuinely like the 40 minutes together, the easy, undemanding company of it. Daniel and I are honestly in a better place than we were before any of this happened, and I don't say that lightly. Not because the truth we uncovered was easy to live with, it wasn't. And there were hard weeks in our own marriage afterward that had nothing to do with Bridget at all and everything to do with two people relearning how to trust each other with difficult information. But because for the first time in our 11 years together, we are both finally looking squarely at the same version of his family, instead of me quietly holding a truth he wasn't ready or able to see. We started together, a very simple new rule for our household not long after that dinner. Any request for money above $200 from anyone for any reason gets discussed by both of us together before either of us gives an answer. It sounds, when I say it out loud, almost embarrassingly basic, almost too small a thing to have mattered this much. It has changed nearly everything about how safe I feel in my own home. Bridget and I are not close, and I want to be honest about that too, because I know some of you watching this are hoping, understandably, for a full redemption arc where she pays back every dollar with interest and shows up at my front door with flowers and a tearful apology. That is not what happened, and I'd rather tell you the truth than give you the ending you might prefer. She has, to her credit, paid back roughly $6,000 over the past year in small, steady increments without being asked twice for any of it, which is more than I honestly expected when I first opened that binder at Carol's dinner table. She has not, as far as I am aware, gone to therapy, though Carol tells me she's thinking about it, which I've learned in this particular family sometimes means something real and sometimes means precisely nothing at all. We speak at family gatherings now. It's civil, careful, both of us clearly working at it. It is not warm, and I genuinely don't know if it ever will be warm again between us. And I have made a real, deliberate peace with the fact that some relationships end not in one dramatic, final rupture, but in a quiet, permanent cooling that never quite freezes solid and never quite fully thaws either. I should also tell you about the conversation Daniel and Bridget had, just the two of them, about 3 weeks after that dinner, one I wasn't present for, and didn't ask to be because I understood by then that some of this repair work had to happen between the two of them alone, without me in the room as a witness or a referee. Daniel told me about it afterward in broad strokes, respecting some of what Bridget had asked him to keep private, though he was careful this time to tell me that he was keeping something private rather than simply doing it silently the way he might have years earlier. He said Bridget had cried for most of the conversation, that she'd admitted haltingly that some of what had started as genuine need in the early years had, at some point she couldn't clearly identify herself, turned into something closer to habit, that asking had simply become easier than any of the alternatives, easier than budgeting carefully, easier than sitting with the discomfort of a no, easier even than examining why she needed so badly to always be the one who was struggling. I don't think she was lying about being scared, Daniel told me that night, sitting on the edge of our bed. I think she was scared the whole time, just not scared of the things she told us she was scared of. I think she was scared that if she stopped needing help, none of us would have a reason to keep paying attention to her at all. I didn't have an answer for that. I'm still not sure I do, even now, telling you this. But I think it's the truest thing anyone in this story said about why any of it happened in the first place, and I wanted you to have it, even though it doesn't excuse a single dollar of what was taken under false pretenses. The redemptive thread in all of this, if there is one, belongs almost entirely to Sophie, and I want to close with her because she's the reason any of this mattered as much as it did to me. She's 10 now. Last month, at a family dinner at Carol's, I watched her ask her own mother a direct, plainly worded question about money for an upcoming school trip. Clearly, evenly, without any of the practiced, performed softness that had always characterized Bridget's own requests to me over the years, and I watched Bridget answer her honestly. Directly, for what I genuinely believe was the very first time I have witnessed, in 10 years of knowing this family, an honest, uncomplicated financial conversation happen in front of a child in that house. Later that same evening, Sophie found me alone in the kitchen while I was helping Carol with the dishes and said, completely out of nowhere with total 10-year-old confidence, "You always tell the truth, even when it's kind of annoying." I laughed genuinely and told her that was probably the nicest insult I'd ever received in my life. She just shrugged, entirely unbothered, and said, "I'm gonna be like that too, I think," before wandering back to the living room to watch television with her grandfather. I think about that sentence more than almost anything else from this entire 9-year story, more even than the binder, more than the confrontation itself. I turn it over sometimes on quiet evenings the way I used to turn over an unexplained discrepancy in someone else's books, looking for the place where it finally, fully makes sense. The truth I keep coming back to. If there is one thing I would want you to take away from all of this, it's the same thought that kept surfacing over and over in the 11 days that email sat unread in my inbox, and in the 6 long weeks I spent quietly deciding what to actually do with what I'd found, and in every reflective, quiet moment since that dinner at Carol's table. Love that only shows up when you're useful was never really love to begin with. It was a bill dressed up carefully in the comfortable language of family so that neither of us would ever have to look directly at what was actually being asked for or what it was actually costing. I don't regret the 9 years, not entirely, and I want to be honest about that complexity too rather than tie it up too neatly. I got Sophie out of them, whole and clear-eyed in a way I'm proud of. I got a version of my own marriage that is genuinely stronger for having finally been tested by the plain truth instead of carefully protected from it for so long. But I no longer confuse being needed with being loved, not even for a moment, and that distinction, once you can finally see it clearly laid out in front of you the way I eventually could, is very, very hard to ever unsee again. Outro. Thank you for staying with me through this whole story. I know it was a long one, and if any part of it meant something to you, I would genuinely love to hear your own version of it in the comments below. Share this with someone who has ever been the one everyone counts on and no one quite checks on in return. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because there are a lot more stories like this one still to tell. And if there's one person in your life right now who needs to hear that being needed and being loved are not the same thing, send them this one. Sometimes the story that finally makes something click isn't the advice a friend gives you directly. It's the one you watch happen to somebody else first, from a safe enough distance to finally see your own version of it clearly. I'll see you in the next one. A final warmth, the Sunday after. I want to leave you with one more scene before I go because I think it says more than any summary could about where things actually landed. 2 Sundays after that dinner at Carol's, Daniel and I had Sophie over to our house for the afternoon, something that had become a regular, easy rhythm between us over the years, one of the few threads that never got tangled up in anything else happening in the family. We made pancakes badly together, the three of us, flour on the counter and on Sophie's elbows and somehow on the ceiling once, and afterward she asked if she could see the drawing, meaning the one from years ago, the one with the dog we didn't have, which I'd mentioned to her once in passing and which she'd apparently never forgotten. I got it out of my desk drawer and handed it to her, and she studied it for a long moment with the same furrowed, serious concentration she'd had at 3 years old making it. "I still think you should get a dog," she said finally, handing it back. "Maybe someday," I told her. "You always say that about things you're actually going to do," she said, matter of fact, already moving on to the next thing, reaching for the syrup. "Mom says someday about things she's not going to do. You say it about things you are. I can tell the difference now." I didn't say anything for a moment. Daniel, standing at the stove, went very still too. It wasn't a dramatic thing for a 10-year-old to say. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without any sense of how much weight it carried for the 2 adults standing in the kitchen with her. But it told me, more clearly than almost anything else in this entire story, that somewhere in the last 9 years, without either of us fully planning it, Sophie had learned to tell the difference between a promise and a performance. She had learned it, I think, mostly by watching me across 100 small, unremarkable Sundays that had nothing to do with money at all, just pancakes and library trips, and someone showing up reliably again and again, without needing anything back in return. That, in the end, is the part of this story I'm proudest of, not the binder, not the spreadsheet, however much work went into it. Just a 10-year-old girl who now knows in her own bones what the real thing is supposed to feel like, because somebody in her family finally stopped pretending the fake version was good enough. What I'd say to someone living this right now. I get messages fairly often now from people who recognize some piece of themselves in stories like this one, and I want to speak directly to that person for a moment before I close this out, because I remember exactly what it felt like to be them for 9 long years. If you're the one in your family who always somehow ends up holding the ledger nobody else wants to keep, the one who gets called when something's needed, not when something's simply wrong, the one whose generosity has quietly become the load-bearing wall holding up everyone else's version of how the family works, I want you to know that noticing the pattern is not the same thing as betraying the people in it. You are allowed to keep a private note in your phone. You are allowed to ask a follow-up question without apologizing for asking it. You are allowed to want the reason behind a request to actually be true, and you are allowed to feel something has gone wrong long before you have proof solid enough to hand anyone else. The hardest part in my experience was never gathering the evidence. It was giving myself permission to trust what I already quietly knew long before the evidence caught up to confirm it. If any part of this story sounds like your own life, I hope you'll take that permission from me now freely, the way I eventually had to find it for myself slowly over 6 difficult weeks at my own kitchen table. One more word on the money. For those of you who have asked in comments on other videos for the practical follow-through on stories like this one, I'll give it to you plainly, because I think it matters, and because I know some of you are living through something similar right now and want to know what actually happens after the confrontation, once the dinner table has been cleared and everyone has gone home. I did close the Venmo account bearing my name within a week of discovering it, working with their support team and eventually with Robert's help to document that it had been opened without my authorization. I did reach out personally and individually to the 2 coworkers Bridget had contacted directly, not to embarrass anyone, but because I felt they deserved to know the truth about where their money had actually gone and why. Both were understanding. One of them, a man named Gerald from our compliance department who I'd worked alongside for 6 years, told me quietly that he'd had a feeling something was off about the request at the time, but hadn't wanted to say anything because he didn't want to seem like he was questioning my family. I told him I understood completely, because I'd spent 9 years doing exactly the same thing to myself. I did not pursue formal legal action against Bridget in the end, despite Robert confirming I had grounds to. That was a decision I made carefully, not out of fear and not out of forgiveness exactly either, but because I understood, sitting with it for those 6 weeks, that what I actually wanted was never punishment. What I wanted was simply to stop being lied to and to make sure everyone else at that table finally had the same true information I had. Once that happened, once the story could no longer survive contact with the actual facts, most of what I needed had already been accomplished. I share that not to tell anyone else what they should do in a similar situation. Every family, every set of circumstances, every specific betrayal is different, and I don't believe there's one correct response that fits all of them. I share it only because I know some of you watching are quietly doing your own math right now, on your own kitchen tables in your own version of this story, and I want you to know that there isn't a wrong way to arrive at your own answer, as long as the answer is finally built on the truth instead of on what's easiest for everyone else to keep believing. A last word on Frank. I mentioned Frank a few times throughout this story, the physical therapy drives, the quiet parking lot question, the way he closed his eyes at that dinner table when he finally asked Bridget to answer him plainly. I want to give him a proper closing because I think he deserves one, and because his part in this story is easy to overlook next to the louder threads. About 4 months after that dinner, Frank asked me, out of nowhere, on one of our old familiar drives to a follow-up appointment he technically no longer needed but had asked to keep anyway, whether I thought he'd failed as a father. I told him honestly that I didn't think the question had a clean answer, that I thought he and Carol had built a family the only way they knew how to build one, using the tools they'd been given themselves, and that the pattern hadn't started with them, even if it had continued through them. He was quiet for a long time after that, watching the road. I think I always knew Bridget needed something we weren't actually giving her, he said eventually, and I think I always knew Daniel was giving up more than any of us ever said thank you for. I just didn't know how to fix either of those things without it feeling like I was choosing one kid over the other, so I didn't fix anything. I just kept hoping it would sort itself out. I told him that I understood that impulse better than he probably realized, having spent 9 years hoping something similar myself. He reached over at a red light and squeezed my hand once briefly, the way you'd thank someone for not making you say more than you already had. I think about Frank often, more than almost anyone else in this story. He wasn't the villain and he wasn't quite the hero either. He was just a tired, decent man who had spent 30 years hoping a hard conversation would somehow have itself, and who finally, at the very end, found the courage to ask one honest question out loud at his own dinner table. Sometimes I think that's the most any of us can really ask of the people who raised us, not perfection, just the eventual willingness to ask the honest question, even decades later than it should have been asked.